going to start by covering day 2, but just to review from last week, in case some of you weren't here, the first day, isn't working. Did I do that or did you do it, Troy? A summary of day 1. Creation on day 1, remember, starts with Genesis 1:1. And God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus Christ are all involved in creation. They're all God. They're all eternal. We talked about time, space, and matter being created. Matter being the fermions, which is the scientific term for particles with mass, and energy was also added. That is seen as light, which is the answer to the question when most people are asked what is created on day 1. Most people say light. It's only just a small part of this. Energy are the bosons, which are particles without mass. And it's not only the light, which is part of the electromagnetic spectrum that's created, but also we talked about gravity, weak nuclear forces, and strong nuclear forces. Just a summary, God creates the universe, He energizes the universe, He fine-tunes the universe, He establishes the laws of nature for the universe, and as we saw with strong nuclear forces, He sustains what He's created. He sustains the universe and is continuing to sustain it today. So at the end of day 1, what you have is a spherical earth hanging in space, and Job 26:7 says, He hangeth the earth upon nothing, and that's exactly what you have at the end of day 1. So day 2. Day 2 is a formation of 2 spaces, you might say. One of them is the hydrosphere and the other is the atmosphere. You can turn, if you want, to Genesis 1st chapter. I've got the verses here on the board, but Genesis 1st chapter, the 6th to the 8th verse says, let there be a firmament, and the firmament here, as we'll show, is the atmosphere on the earth. In the midst of the waters, hydro, of course, refers to waters. The waters is the hydrosphere. We're going to talk about both of these in detail here today. And let it divide the waters from the waters. Divide, key word there. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so, and God called the firmament heaven. So what you have here is the waters on the earth here, the firmament, but the waters are divided, so there's waters above the firmament too, which is called a water canopy. Now, a lot of people think that creationists all agree. They go to the Bible and they see what's there, and they all agree on this. I can tell you that a lot of people don't agree with what I'm going to say today, including Answers in Genesis, by the way. Answers in Genesis does not believe in a canopy theory. Although the Institute of Creation Research does. Henry Morris was the founder of that. Henry Morris was a professor of hydrophysics, water and physics, at the University of Minnesota before he founded the Institute of Creation Research, and much of what I'm going to say really comes out of his writings on this. But it just shows you that not everybody agrees on everything. All creationists don't agree on everything that's in the Bible. I don't understand how they can take those verses that I just read and not see that there's a division of the waters and that there's waters above the firmament. I'm going to obviously talk in detail about that here now. Now, the atmosphere, the firmament means expanse. It also means the visible arch of the sky. The The reference is to the atmosphere between the two waters, as it's described there. The firmament is for sure the atmosphere, because in Genesis first chapter, the 20th verse, which we'll get to probably next time, it says, and whoops, I'm hitting the wrong buttons here. And fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. This is exactly the same word that's used in verses 6 and 8. So the same word is used for firmament when birds or animals that fly are created on day 5. Therefore, it is the atmosphere or the envelope of gases that's surrounding the earth that's being referred to here. The atmosphere is a protective layer of gases, as we know, and acts to shelter the life here on earth. And the atmosphere keeps the temperatures within a small range, also blocks out harmful rays from the sun. So we see this atmosphere, and it is between the waters, between these two layers of water here. Verse 6 says that the firmament is in the midst of the waters. That means that the atmosphere is in the midst, or it's between, or in the center of the waters. And verse 7 it refers to, as I've said, divided the waters. Waters under the atmosphere would be a shoreless ocean, as you can see here. And then the waters above would form a canopy or a covering over the entire atmosphere and earth. Now, the canopy would be of water vapor. It is not clouds. It's not fog. It's not ice crystals. All of those are opaque. And their clouds are minute droplets of water, of course, as we know, because when the clouds come over, a lot of times it will rain. Thus, a cloud would be opaque and you couldn't see through it. This, on the other hand, is water vapor. Water, as any chemical, exists in 3 states. It's in a solid state, a liquid state, and a gaseous state. And in other words, we have ice, liquid water, and water vapor. And water vapor is a gaseous state of water. There's water vapor in the air right here, right now. As a gas, water vapor is totally invisible. That's the property of a gas. It's invisible. So you could see stars through this canopy. It's been a lot of people who criticize this and say, well, you couldn't see stars through it. No, water vapor is a gas, and you can see stars with no problem. Would be transparent and would be above the Earth's atmosphere. Well, where was this canopy in the atmosphere? And there's different theories associated with this also. It states that the water is above the firmament. It's not in it. Therefore, the firmament is essentially a part of the atmosphere. We just said that the animals fly in this firmament. And where do they fly in the atmosphere that we have today? Down here in the troposphere. As you can see, this is about 8 to 9 miles high, the troposphere is. And then after that, you hit the stratosphere, and then you go into mesosphere, ionosphere, or thermosphere. So the troposphere is really what's being talked about here, because it's where the animals fly, and that clearly is below 8 miles. They don't even get close to 8 miles. So the canopy would be high. Most people theorize, who believe in this theory, feel that it's going to be in this area right in the upper troposphere, lower stratosphere. Now, what effects, and this is the interesting part of this whole theory, the effects that this would have on the earth. The first effect would be that it would retain incoming solar radiation. that would retain more of this radiation that we get from the sun. Now, we hear a lot about carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas with the model of global warming that's being discussed, of course, now. However, water vapor is the most important greenhouse gas that we have. It is responsible for 90% of the Earth's natural greenhouse effect. It's not carbon dioxide, it's water vapor that really is the key to greenhouse gases. And this keeps the Earth warm so that obviously life can exist here on Earth. A quotation on this is it's stated that the absorption of the outgoing radiation from the Earth is largely due to water vapor. So in other words, with retaining and incoming more of this solar radiation, you'd have what is a global greenhouse effect. Now, a canopy would more uniformly distribute the solar radiation over the entire Earth. And this canopy would be able to uniformly more distribute this solar radiation from the sun, and this would result in uniform, mild temperatures all over the world. Now that is an interesting part, and remember that for some of the things I'm going to talk about here in just a second. The effects of the water canopy would also be, number two, great air mass movements, or wind, in other words, wind storms, wind itself, which we experience a lot here in Rochester, Minnesota, would not take place. There wouldn't be any windstorms because of uniform temperatures. The reason for wind is temperature variations in the atmosphere. That's why we have wind. Wind is primarily due, as it states here, to differences in temperature within the atmosphere. A third effect that this canopy would have is uniform humidity. The humidity would be uniform all over the world. This gives a kind of a terrarium effect. A terrarium, of course, is an encapsulated atmosphere. It produces itself, and that it's like a greenhouse, in other words. So those are some of the changes that would take place. No rain would fall. Now this is again something that's fairly controversial among creationists. But no rain would fall. With uniform temperatures, there would be very little wind. With very little wind, there's no weather fronts would occur, no clouds would form. Henry Morris went into long discussions on why clouds would not form with a vapor canopy. And thus no rainfall would occur without any clouds. So the entire hydrologic cycle was different prior to the flood. And it is described, the hydrological cycle prior to the flood is described in Genesis 2nd chapter. I know that you see a lot of pictures, drawings of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and almost always there are cumulus clouds in the background, which look great. And let's face it, we live in a state which has beautiful cumulus clouds, but that's probably not true. It probably weren't any clouds at all at that particular time. So the present hydrological cycle, which we have going on outside right now today, is that clouds form over the waters, over the ocean, primarily by evaporation, and they form primarily on salt crystals that are from the salinity of the ocean, and dust particles also. Then they come over the earth. They rain down the water, and of course their surface runoff here goes into lakes and rivers, and then the rivers take that water back to the ocean, and then there's also some underground water flow that also goes underneath. So that's basically the hydrological cycle that we have today. Genesis 2, however, describes a different hydrological cycle. Verse 5 says, "For the Lord had not caused it to rain upon the earth." There was not a man to till the ground, but there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. A mist from the earth watering the whole face of the ground. There was no rainfall, in other words, due to the canopy. A mist watered the ground. And the mist that is talked about here is a water supply from evaporation and condensation, which is what we would term as dew formation, which you see here on the slide, from the normal temperature changes from the normal day-night cycle. There's going to be temperature changes between the night and the day, and that forms dew from the water vapor that's present in the air. And that's how the ground was watered. It clearly states that in Genesis 2nd chapter. Added to that, there was a different hydrological cycle pre-flood described in verse 10. It says, and a river went out of Eden. This is after the time the Garden of Eden is developed. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became 4 heads. And then the heads are named. Don't get hung up on looking at the names of the 4 heads and seeing Euphrates there and trying to figure out where the Garden of Eden is. As I'll talk about with the flood, it is totally gone. You cannot know where the Garden of Eden is. Our earth is, and I'll cover that when I get to the flood, but it was completely and utterly destroyed at that time. So the pre-flood hydrological cycle for rivers was also different. Rivers were fed from the fountains of the deep, subterranean water channels, which we know existed because those were broken up at the time of the flood when God judged this earth. There was pressure in these subterranean reservoirs because of the heat of the earth. The earth mantle would heat the water. That forces that water out onto the land to originate a river. And the rivers were kind of the opposite of what they are today. When we see rivers, they get larger and larger as they flow. In this particular case, the origin of the river was large at its beginning, but then it broke into what was called distributaries, and the 4 heads of the one coming out of the Garden of Eden are actually named. So it's almost like the best analogy I can make here, it's much like an irrigation system that was present at that particular time rather than what we have today. And, an irrigation system, of course, is you force the water out and then it's channeled onto the ground, and that's how you water the earth. A 5th change that takes place. These conditions would result in lush vegetation everywhere in the world. Because of these mild temperatures and human conditions all over the world, you wouldn't see ice caps. This is the Arctic ice cap here. And you also wouldn't see deserts. It would be uniform humidity and temperatures all over the entire earth. It's interesting that this is exactly what you see in history. Lush vegetation all over the earth. That's exactly what you see. E.H. Colbert here has a quotation. In those days, what he's talking about those days is the dinosaur age. And he is an evolutionist, by the way. He's now passed away, but he was at the American Museum of Natural History. But in those days, the earth had a tropical or subtropical climate over much of its land surface. And in the widespread tropical lands, there was an abundance of lush vegetation. The land was low and there were no high mountains forming physical or climatic barriers. It's exactly what you would predict as a creationist from the Bible. Exactly what you would predict. So it's, and then, what's their explanation for this? Well, another quotation, these guys are evolutionists also. The universal tropicality which is referred to up here, is difficult to explain. Very difficult for them to explain. Evolutionists admit, without a very good explanation, I'll get into their explanation here in the next slide, but they admit that Antarctica, for instance, was once warm. Antarctica has at least 1 mile of ice on it, 5,000 to 10,000 feet of ice on the surface of Antarctica. But when you core down, you can find subtropical vegetation down on the surface of Antarctica. How can that be explained? Well, the evolutionist explanation for this tropical effect was explained on the basis of the sun's solar energy increasing for the dinosaur age and decreasing for the ice age. The problem with this is almost no scientist believes that. The astronomers don't believe that. They don't agree that a change in the sun's energy is even possible, and the measurements that have made for the changes that take place in the radiation of the sun are very, very small. As a matter of fact, they're 0.1% of variation. That's it. So there isn't any evidence that this explanation could really explain it. Creationists, however, with a water vapor canopy, as described in the Bible, answers how there could be a tropical climate at both poles. So again, the Bible is really gives a very good scientific explanation of how this could be possible. A sixth change that would take place: the canopy would filter out harmful radiation. It would help to filter out more of the harmful radiation anyway than we have today. The water vapor filters out, the atmosphere itself filters out the radiation that we get from the sun, both ultraviolet radiation and also some cosmic radiation that we get from space itself. Now, these types of radiation are harmful to life. They're the primary source of mutation. When we get mutations that occur in our DNA, that is from radiation largely. Another problem that we have is aging, and the aging that takes place, the cross-linkages of the collagen that we have that gives us wrinkles and all those kind of things, it's from radiation. That's why you shouldn't lay out in the sun, for instance. So those things will promote aging or advance the aging process. So with harmful radiation being filtered out by a water vapor canopy, one could expect, prior to the time of the flood, better health and more longevity. Well, again, what do you see in the Bible? Well, you see that the lifespan of man prior to the flood is many, many, many years more longer than ours. According to the Bible, Adam lived 930 years, Methuselah 969 years. What's the average lifespan now? Well, it's about 80 years old. That's it. So those things could be an explanation. I'll probably talk about this more when I talk about the flood. There are other things that probably contributed to that lengthening lifespan, including a lot of changes in genetics. Think of the size of the sauropod dinosaurs. Gigantic. The sauropods, you can see here in this picture here, there's a man standing here with an elephant. That's an African elephant, which is the largest land animal today. And these are dinosaurs that are on the same scale. They're absolutely gigantic. A Diplodocus, which is here, Diplodocus could be looking in that window without any problem right now. Might even have to bend down a little bit to look in the window of this church. So these things are huge. Well, how did these animals get so big? Well, reptiles grow throughout their entire lifespan. And that's true today also. The longer they live, the larger they become. There are reptiles do that, amphibians do that. Interestingly enough, rats also do that, by the way. But most mammals, you quit growing. We quit growing when we're somewhere around 20 years old or so. We quit growing. But not true with a reptile. They continue to grow throughout their entire life. And with an ideal climate now, we got mild temperatures, we got humidity, we have great amounts of lush vegetation everywhere. These are vegetation eaters. They eat plants. You end up with some dinosaurs that are up to 120 feet long and weigh an estimated 70 to 90 tons. These animals are huge. The reason they're huge is they're old. They continue to grow through their whole lifespan. They don't reach that size in like a year. It takes many years for them to get that big. So these are very old animals. Makes sense based on the canopy and filtering out harmful radiation and these huge amounts of vegetation that would be present on the earth at this particular time. Another change that would take place because of this is an increase in atmospheric pressure. This is a primary criticism of this theory by evolutionists and creationists. And they claim that the water vapor would increase the pressure so high that it would crush life. And that's true, depending on how much water vapor you put up in the canopy itself. And of course, they want it to crush life, so they put a lot up there, and shows that they would actually would increase the atmospheric pressure to the point where life could not exist. So their calculations are based on how much water is there. The Bible states, keep in mind that the waters were divided. There was still water on earth, and some of these calculations actually take all the water on earth and put it up in the atmosphere. That's not what the Bible says. It says that the waters were divided. Most creationists propose that the atmospheric pressure would be about double of the present day pressure. In other words, we're at 1 atmosphere. It would be 2 atmospheres that we would be living under. This increase in pressure would be no problem, especially if everything was created under that particular pressure. It's really sudden changes in pressure that are the problem and that are detrimental to life. There is medical evidence also that you have better health in hyperbaric conditions. You get, as a matter of fact, if you have a hyperbaric oxygen treatment is a way for treatment. The Mayo Clinic, for instance, they use hyperbaric treatments in some of their patients with burn patients and also with wounds that aren't healing well. And we've done also research with using animals and the wound healing in animals in hyperbaric conditions also, in hyperbaric chambers. I want to go back here. So the medical evidence that you get faster and more efficient healing. This has to do with driving more oxygen under a higher pressure. It drives more oxygen into the body, so the oxygen can be used more efficiently by the body. And as I said, it's actually used in patients now. And interestingly enough, is one of the prescriptions when people go into hyperbaric conditions is 2 atmospheres. Another interesting dilemma for evolutionists are the flying reptiles, the pterosaurs. These are pteranodons here. A drawing of a painting of a two pteranodons. Notice one thing, that they're they look like they're in the Grand Canyon here, and that could be the Grand Canyon. But anyway, they're by cliffs, for instance. And you almost always see these pictures with them by cliffs. The evolutionists, the reason that is they can't fly in our present atmosphere. They can't get off the ground. They don't have enough power to be able to get off the ground because they're too large. And the evolutionists proposed that these flying reptiles had to live near cliffs and more or less jump off the cliffs and then hang glide, essentially, and then look for food. They have a lot of problems with that, though, because if they come down to get food, or if something happens and they happen to land and they're not on a cliff, they're in trouble because they can't get back off. The reason is because the males, the pteranodon males, are 25 feet in wingspan. 25 feet is just aerodynamically too large to get up. So this was trying to be explained until this particular pterosaur was discovered, which is Quetzalcoatlus. He was found in Texas, and this particular flying reptile has a wingspan of 40 to 45 feet. Now that is aerodynamically impossible to get off the ground. Impossible. Interesting thing is, though, the dilemma is solved if you put a water vapor canopy, increase the atmospheric pressure at 2 atmospheres, that animal can fly. So it's interesting that it explains a lot of the problems and dilemmas that the evolutionists have had. So what we know from science actually fits what's written in the Word of God here. And the last thing is the water vapor canopy, of course, is the reservoir for the waters that fell for 40 days and 40 nights at the beginning of the time of the flood. I'll get into a lot more detail of that when I get to that point, but Genesis 7:12 says, "And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights." How did that happen? When you get rain everywhere on the earth at the same time. Canopy explains that. Now to day two. So in day 2, we, just as a review, we have the hydrosphere and the atmosphere being created. 2 spaces. Day 3, I'm going to try to cover that in about 5 minutes. It may be possible. But day 3 is, it's described in first chapter of Genesis, 9th and 10th verses. "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land," which is the scientific term for dry land is the lithosphere, "let the dry land appear," and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. So the creation of dry land above the the ocean's water level was created at this particular time. Many people believe that there was one continent at this particular time, rather than the multiple continents that we have on Earth today. The rivers were formed at this particular time, including the subterranean water channels, or what in the Bible is referred to as the fountains of the deep, were formed as a part of the lithosphere also at this particular time. Day 3 goes on in verse 11 and 12 to say that let the earth bring forth grass, which is the biosphere now being formed. The biosphere is everything from treetops on down to the surface of the earth. That's where life essentially is. The herb yielding seed and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, as it says there, and herb yielding seed after its kind again used, and the tree yielding fruit whose seed is in itself, again after its kind. Well, so vegetation or plant life is created here on day 3. Created in fertile land, obviously, the lithosphere, which was just created. Now, the created plants could reproduce themselves. There's no thought of evolution here at all. It's all creation itself. They could reproduce themselves. They all had the seed within itself, as it says there. And they could reproduce after their specific kind. The phrase after its kind is used here 3 times for plants, and actually it's going to be used 10 times in the first chapter of Genesis. Again, no thought of evolution here at all. So each organism has its own seed containing the DNA to reproduce itself. So deoxyribonucleic acid was created on here at this time on day 3, which we know is a double helix, a very complicated, chemical, and it contained, the DNA contained the information needed to produce the specific plant that it coded for in that particular plant. That's what it means when it says that it was after its kind. DNA allows for variability. As we know, there's variability in people or animals. There's variability in plants also. There's variability in varieties of corn, for instance. But it's always corn. It's never changes to another plant. 3 types of general types of plants were created, and if you think about it, all vegetation will fall into one of these 3 categories. The grasses were created. The herbs, which most people feel refers to bushes, shrubs, for instance, and then the woody plants, which are the trees. All 3 of those being created on day 3. Now, these plants were not made as seeds, which would grow into a plant. They were made as full-grown plants. And it says there that they were full-grown plants containing seed, or fruit containing seed. So the trees already had fruit on them when they were created. So this gets into the appearance of age here. These plants were full-grown adults. They were mature, in other words. And the appearance of age is not only true for plants, but it's true of all the animals and man when they are created in the first week. So at the end of that first week, what you have is a complete, working, functioning universe. Now, some people will say that the appearance of age is a problem. It could be a problem with calculating ages of the earth, how long we've been here, because with the appearance of age, that could, many of the methods of aging are only giving you an apparent age, not a true age, based on a lot of assumptions. And it's difficult to say with creation what the appearance of age could do to some of these aging techniques. A lot of people will criticize and say, well, God is fooling us, or why is he being deceptive in creating a tree that looks like it's 30 years old when it's only just been created a couple of minutes ago. It's not, God's not deceptive at all. He's told us what he did. He told us in this book. Now, a lot of people don't believe it, but it's in here. It's his word. He wrote this. He gave us the information. He's not being deceptive at all. He's he's being right up front. He told us how he created it. He created mature plants on day 3, containing seed, fruit on trees. I mean, that's not deceptive. He's told us exactly what had occurred. So, summary of day 3. Also, we have 2 other spaces that are formed here, the lithosphere and the plant biosphere. And as I mentioned, the plant biosphere is from the treetops down to the surface of the earth. So, a summary of the first 3 days. The first day, of course, we have the basics created, the time, space, matter, and energy universe. And then on day 2, we have the hydrosphere being created and the atmosphere. And then on day 3, we have the lithosphere, dry land, and the biosphere being created. And then now you'll see in the next 3 days, the 4, 5, and 6, what God does is he fills those spaces in which he's created on the first 3 days. And we'll go into that next time.